Thank you for inviting me to this talk because I think there is a lot of room to talk. Like, I'm not gonna necessarily have authoritative answers to all of the questions because we're still exploring this phenomenon. And so tradwives originally, actually earlier in the more like the 2000s and the 2010s, actually first emerged as a term on British television because a woman came on a show and talked about being a tradwife. And then some of our earliest research actually looked at some women who were connected to like white nationalism, or white supremacist groups. And so originally people were concerned about tradwife culture because of the ways they supported white supremacy. But then with the pandemic, actually, we've seen a shift, where there's been sort of this commodification of the tradwife look or lifestyle, where women are presenting often very costly versions of a tradwife aesthetic. So we think about like Nara Smith, or the woman who is most famous for the Ballerina Farms article that came out, and her account. But they themselves do not identify as tradwives, interestingly. But then we also are seeing more research about this sort of like everyday tradwife phenomenon, like everyday people who feel an affiliation with that title. So at its heart, a lot of the tradwives identify that they're stay-at-home mothers or stay-at-home wives. They see a very gendered relationship, in a very, like they say traditional, but they really mean kind of like 1930s to 1950s, where the husband is the primary breadwinner, the wife stays at home and minds the house and minds the children. Many of them do talk about the idea of submission in the sense that the husband is sort of the leader of the family or of the couple. And we could absolutely spend an entire hour just talking about what they define as submission if we want to get into that, because even their definitions vary. And in the studies that I did with my colleague Ashley Nelson, with these sort of more everyday tradwives, we did see a lot of variation, in how they define themselves. So some you couldn't really tell a difference between them and stay-at-home moms, that it was just very like mommy blogger content. Some of them did fall, most were sort of conservative leaning, broadly defined, some of them into more right wing or sort of authoritarian versions of that. Um, Most of them had pretty clear concepts of gender as being something biologically based, not necessarily socially based, but also were articulated a lot of knowledge around gender roles and sort of who is supposed to do what, in the house. So even amongst household chores, for example, one tradwife talked about negotiating with her husband what were pink chores and what were blue chores. So pink chores were like laundry and blue chores was like taking out the trash, right? So they actually negotiated a lot of what submission looked like. So they come from a lot of different places, and we were surprised because some of them did come from more what you might call like a liberal space. Despite the earliest conception of tradwives as being predominantly white, almost half of our sample were people of color, primarily African American, but a couple of people who also identified as Hispanic or Latino. So there was actually a wider variation than I think we've seen in the media at this point. So that's actually, it sounds like a simple question to say, like, what is a tradwife? But it's actually surprisingly complicated. And so when you try to boil it down to sort of what are the core elements, it is that the husband is the primary breadwinner, the mother is staying at home. There are often ways that they negotiate, the husband being the leader of the family unit. It often does have tasks, even in the home, that are assigned differently to the husband and the wife. But everything else that kind of gets attached to that sort of varies.
And how does that differ? Because there have long been stay-at-home parents, there have long been, stay-at-home wives. And that's not necessarily to do with something being feminist or traditional or not traditional. It's just often, it's the norm in a lot of places around the world, and it is the reality for a lot of people here in France or where you are in the US. So how does this sort of it is traditional, but sort of family setup differ from the specific tradwife phenomenon. How does a tradwife differ from, say, a stay-at-home parent?
Yeah, for some women, there wasn't a difference. Like they used the terms pretty interchangeably, which was also interesting that they seemed to be missing some of the more philosophical or political like meaning behind the tradwife identity. But for the bulk of them, it really did come down to, not just a partner choosing to stay at home, but that it was the female partner who chooses to stay at home. Again, back to that kind of that idea of the pink chores and the blue chores, that a family runs best, like best when it's organized around gendered lines. Some of the women, probably about a third, were very anti-feminist. Like they verbalized a lot of conflict with feminism as a movement. Some of the ideas around feminism, like they talked about feeling tricked into participating in capitalism, that families and society were healthier when there was this gendered organization of the home. So I think the key difference for a lot of the women between that stay-at-home mom label and the tradwife identity is that little bit more political, you know, seeing the value of organizing social life and family life around these stricter gendered lines.
Yeah, and that sense that it's almost biologically determined, as opposed to an economic reality, or one person wants to spend more time with the kids and do a career later or not. It's more like this is the biological reality: is the woman does this and the man does that.
Yeah. Like we did have actually one trad wife who was married to another woman. So again, sort of the
Mm,
surprising who's in the mix. And they were an interracial couple, which was really interesting. But the poster was the one who identified as a trad wife, and she stayed at home, and her wife worked and fulfilled all the masculine roles. She fulfilled all the feminine roles, right? Like she always just when you think of like queer culture, right? Like she always dressed as like the femme, and her partner always dressed more masculine. And so they had very gendered lines, but even within the context of a lesbian relationship, right? Like that there was this, so there had to be a negotiation there, obviously. But for the other couples, the sort of biologicalness or the biological mandate of sort of who stays home and who goes to work fell along those biological lines rather than it being a negotiation or who has more earning potential or who wants to work, who wants to stay home. Like there was sort of no opening for a lot of those families to consider the husband staying at home and the wife working, for example.
right. So let's talk more about this study that you did. You and your colleague Ashley Nelson, you followed 60 self-styled tradwives was it on TikTok?
On TikTok, yeah.
Right. So, you talked a little bit about what you found, but I want to ask about the motivations that you uncovered for these 60 women to become tradwives.
Yeah. It was really interesting because again, I think in the literature, we we hear a lot about the part that we did find it that they were espousing anti-feminist views, that it was a rejection of that idea that women could be good workers and had a place in the capitalist, waged labor workforce. And that was definitely one of the themes that a lot of women felt a lot of pressure because this is also a lot of these women, they were in their 20s and early 30s. And so they grew up in an era where there was a lot of language around like lean in and be a boss babe, be a hustler. Like this idea that's really common, I think, in a lot of our industrialized spaces right now, right? Is like the overworking. Like you can only be successful if you like outperform expectations, if you outperform men, if you do 60 and 80 hours a week, and then you can make it and you can be financially independent. And, a lot, a lot of them expressed not just seeing that as an option, but feeling it as a pressure to perform as wage laborers. And that they saw sort of adopting their tradwife lifestyle as a rejection of that mandate, and like a revaluation of women's spaces in the home. A lot of them articulated that they didn't appreciate the way that, they sort of lumped all the different waves of feminism together, but just feminism broadly defined, devalued motherhood and femininity. They put a really strong contrast between feminism and femininity. Some of the more vitriolic ones had very strong language around like feminism is anti-feminine and things like that. Um, and so that was one of the themes. One of the other themes that we saw that emerged for why some of the women were interested in trad life was actually because of some health or mental health reasons that they themselves had um, conditions. So like one woman talked about having Chiari malformation, where like the base of your brain can actually like slide into your spinal column. And so which is it's sort of like having epilepsy or other, neurological conditions where you can be fine, 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 and then you're not fine, right? Like, and it can be a surprise. And so it can be difficult to manage in a workforce, right? To know when you're going to be able to complete a task or not. Um, Many of them talked about depression, anxiety. Many of them actually talked about postpartum depression, and other, mental health issues that they um, didn't perceive workplaces as accommodating and welcoming and supportive spaces for them to be dealing with their various health issues. Some of them also, another one that I would love to like do more research into and study a little bit harder, is this idea of safety, actually, that a lot of the women also articulated like they didn't drive, they didn't leave the house without their husbands unless it was an emergency. They didn't go out at night. That there was this perception that the world was unsafe for women, right? Which again is not untrue, right? Like we do know that women bear a disproportionate burden in terms of managing their safety, right? But their like solution to that perceived lack of safety was essentially to isolate, right? To kind of create these small bubbles. If I can just create like my husband, my immediate family, and my children, if that's like my whole world, and whenever I leave my house, my husband is with me to protect me, it was their way of trying to create a sense of safety in a world that felt unsafe for women in particular. But I'm sure you've all seen the news. Most of our sample was from here in the US. And they talked also about homeschooling their children. The majority of them homeschooled their children. And a particular subset talked about one of the reasons being that they thought schools were also unsafe, right? Because we do have issues with gun violence in our schools here. And so even keep removing their children, right? Like isolating their children became part of that, sort of creating this little bubble of perceived safety around their families to try to protect themselves, I guess you could say. And we can absolutely go into how that doesn't necessarily protect you. But that was their solution at the moment for their sense of a lack of safety. And for some women, it was also just a really like practical choice. So one woman talked about her husband works in an oil field and he would be gone for a month at a time. And so part of their pattern was that when he was gone, she would take care of the house. She was basically a single parent, right? But then when he was coming home, she would dress up, she would bake bread, she would, do all of these like homemaker things because then when he came home, then he would see that she was okay. The kid would there at that time they had one child, like that their child was okay, that everything was good, so good that she could like bake homemade bread and food and have, if food was on the stove, then like everything was okay, right? And so she also saw that as protecting her husband because then she was like, when he's out in the oil field, then he doesn't have to worry about us, right? Like he knows I've got it under control, which was also interesting. I love her so much. I would love to just like interview her one day. She had such an interesting perspective on on how she became a trad wife that we actually, her and one other woman, another woman was actually an OnlyFans model, and then became a trad wife. And this woman, who married the oil worker was actually, she worked like in, was it casinos, like gambling establishments and serving drinks and, kind of a highly sexualized space where women are you get a better tip when you smile and, things like that. And then just talked about being really tired of that life. And so, like, the solidity of the working class husband who can come home to the beautiful wife just felt more stable to her than that lifestyle of trying to always like smile to make enough money, right? So they actually came into it for a variety of reasons. There was also a strong religious element for some of the women. That I'm not particularly a Christian, but they talked about various Bible verses that talk about like what a woman is supposed to be, like that they wanted to be like Ruth, or there was a particular Psalms verse that they quoted that outlines how women are supposed to be. And so they saw part of their interest in traditional life was actually a mechanism to bring them closer to their spirituality and religious tradition, rather than necessarily a social statement. So a variety, short answer is that they had a variety of reasons for why they chose to enter trad life.
Well, it's so interesting because I think a lot of the reasons that they have, they're responding to the same thing that feminism has been responding to for a very long time, and coming up with the opposite answer, which is that your role in life is determined by your biological gender. I'm thinking of, second wave feminism and the push for wages for housework to say, tradwives are saying the work inside the home is important, and feminists agree.
Mhm.
And there's been this push that that should be unpaid labor should, if not be paid, then in some way acknowledged that the nuclear family is not set up to have two breadwinners. These are under a neoliberal capitalist model. These are arguments that feminists have been making. Um,
Yeah.
and I think what was very interesting to me was there was kind of like a conflation of feminism and capitalism. They were some of the women that you were studying were ascribing the problems of capitalism to feminism. Feminism had a lot of criticisms of the hashtag boss babe, girl boss culture. So to, that is what fascinates me is we're kind of responding to the same set of structural issues.
Yeah.
And in one direction, you can end up with, okay, well, let's talk about reorganizing care work in our society so that everybody is free to make the choices that they are able to or that they want to. And one says, no, no, the answer to this, this square peg doesn't go in this round hole. So let's do 1950s, um, homemaker culture is the only way. And you do that based on the sex that you were born in.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting because I mean, hmm, their antagonisms towards feminism were very focused on certain aspects of feminism, right? Because there are also, feminists who, say if you're not on top in the sexual act, that it's anti-feminist, or if you have children, it's anti-feminist, right? Like that there are strains of feminism, and they didn't see the way that many of the cases they were trying to make did resonate. And so I actually took some hope from that on the one hand, like where you started, like looking at people who are doing this type of regressive societal motion can be very disheartening. But actually, in talking to I've been on another panel with some other feminists, and we walked away from it like, but they're so close, right? Like they're so close to seeing like the problem, like we agree actually on a lot of the problem. It's just that the sort of like solution that we're coming to that sort of is differing. And so how can you help people, move away from that urge to be self-protective and like I can't solve everything, but maybe I can solve it for myself, right? Like and see the value of the social action, to see the way that their movement, and movement is even too strong of a word, but like their urge to retreat to the trad life, right, is actually consistent with some areas of feminism. That it actually might be an interesting way to see this rather than a community that they often get cited as a community that could get recruited into nationalism and extremism. I'm like, they actually have the potential to be recruited into feminism if we could find ways to help them also see the connections that like we all agree, like women have an impossible task right now to be full-time workers and full-time home carers, right? Like it's like we all agree with that, right? Like we all agree boss babe culture is freaking hard. Like who can maintain that, right? Like, so there's a lot of points of agreements. And it felt sometimes like they're walking right up to that like almost like feminist insight moment and instead kind of like and go right
Yeah.
instead of like leaping into feminism.
Well, we've done a previous edition of the evidence in a previous webinar on the manosphere.
Mm.
And I wonder, you talked about this group of people are often kind of characterized as being at risk of kind of tipping into extremism. Some of them may already have extreme views. Do we see the tradwife kind of sphere as mirroring the manosphere, the Andrew Tate, the male influencer sphere on the other side?
In some ways, I think yes, and in some ways, I think no, because a lot of the manosphere content we're seeing is trying to like rewrite gender roles. And in that sense, there's similarity, right? Like they're trying to reaffirm these biologically based differences between men and women, and that those biological differences dictate things that women are better at or men are better at, right? Um, but a lot of the manosphere focuses on grievances like men feeling slighted in their masculinity or the loss of power and control in their masculinity, particularly their control over women. Um, and a lot of the women's spaces, because tradwives aren't the only women's sort of regressive women's culture like this on the internet. There's also like the stay-at-home girlfriends group. There's feminine coaches. There's what is it called? Female dating. I always forget the last word. Female dating something. Oh, it'll come to me in a minute. Strategy, female dating strategy, which is much more looking at like the transactional part of relationships as opposed to like love and romance and all that kind of stuff. Um, and so where men, it feels the men's spaces feel like they're trying to like reassert dominance and reassert control. Um, Women's don't have that same kind of grievance. It's more the like women are tired. Like we are so tired of trying to be everything to everyone. Um, and so it doesn't feel like trying to reassert like social control in the same way that the manosphere does.
Mhm.
But it does mirror a lot of the same language. It does support some of what the manosphere is saying. But just like, what have we been learning for the last 200 years? Like women have their own motivations and they're not just replicating the manosphere. Like women have their own drives and their own interests in creating these spaces that are different from men's. So, which I think we're still like unpacking. Um, and actually, in one of the papers that Ashley and I worked on, we talked about this theme that, again, I think we need to like dig into more, this idea of like romanticizing that a lot of these women's cultures, like the stay-at-home girlfriend culture, it's like
Mm.
you just stay at home, you work all day, you ex on yourself, like you get your massage, you get your facial, you get your exercise in, look beautiful for when he comes home, but your full day of work is yourself, right?
Mm.
And then this idea of, tradwife life can have a lot of drudgery. Like if you're baking your 6,000th loaf of sourdough bread, right? Like you're doing your 40 millionth load of laundry. And they use this language around romanticizing that was their way to both like make it through the drudgery, but also to like validate the gendered relationship. So almost in a Disney princess kind of way, right? Like they didn't want like a plan B. One woman specifically said, I don't want a prenuptial agreement. I don't want a plan B. Like I'm all in with my husband. Like, isn't it sad to be thinking about an escape plan? Like
Mm.
he's my everything, right? Like that they want this romantic version that aesthetic of the tradwife life, I think offers. So romanticizing in two different ways, right? One, like romanticizing in the sense of like, how do you make it through your millionth load of laundry? But also romanticizing in how do you like make sense of wanting to do this life? And we're starting to see like there's, I don't know if you're familiar with like mob wives also, where if you think of like the Godfather movies where the wives all knew their husbands were doing something naughty, but they didn't ask questions as long as they like maintained a certain lifestyle. There's a whole trend of like mob wives as well. And it's I saw an awesome YouTuber actually who she did a video about tradwives and she called it cosplay for the patriarchy, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if all your viewers are familiar with cosplay, but like this idea of dressing up, right, and playing a character, and that we're seeing a lot of women's spaces like the mob wives, the tradwives, right, have that element of like dressing up, that seems to be absent from some of the manosphere. So again, like they're reflections in some ways of each other, but women and men's motivations are different and they're trying to accomplish different things in these online communities.
Well, it just kind of points to a contradiction that I struggle with the tradwives, is that it's all about having this traditional marriage, which means submitting to your husband, and you are not working, you are out, you are quitting capitalism, despite the fact that you are doing the work that props up capitalism, but leave that to the side. You're quitting capitalism, you're quitting hustle culture, you're not working, you're submitting, you're staying quiet, and yet you have this social media presence which maybe you're monetizing. So
Yes.
maybe you are working, maybe you are participating, but this contradiction is never addressed. And some of the biggest trad wives are like going on TV and talking about the trad life and presumably getting paid for that. These are actually, many of them are women with careers and they are
Yes.
hustling. They're just hustling for the trad wife movement. I
Yeah.
just wonder, does that irony, am I the only one?
No. No, it's come up in a variety of ways. And even listening to the women trying to narrate it,
Mm,
um, so some of the folks who've researched the more aesthetic tradwives, so again, like Nara Smith, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the woman who is the Ballerina Farms accounts, like that's her account name. But she married a super wealthy like airline executive guy, and she always has this aesthetic of like living in this like country home and like dancing in front of her. She wanted to be a ballerina before she got
mm,
married, like dancing in her kitchen. And but then people point out her stove is like a $10,000 stove, and her clothes, while they look like simple and homespun, are actually like $2,000 sweaters. And um that, and those accounts tend to be the larger accounts, right? And like Nora Smith is actually a model. And so she is modeling clothes. She is
mm.
being, commissioned or whatever the right word is to put on a particular outfit while she is home making a Snickers bar, So there's the aesthetic tradwives, if we can call them that, are absolutely like selling the tradwife lifestyle, even if they don't call themselves tradwives. But then these everyday tradwives, most of them had teeny tiny accounts. They were like
Mm,
100 people. They had like 5 comments per video, like that. These women who were putting their life on the internet were searching in some ways for validation or connection with other women because their bubbles were so small, that it was more of a social component rather than a selling component. But a lot of them did talk about not like wage labor, but gig work, multi-level, like selling types of schemes, that many, stay-at-home moms also get involved in.
mhm.
Um, Two of them were actually, what's the right word? Physical trainers. Like,
Right.
yeah, one was a bodybuilder, one was currently a bodybuilder, and sold lessons about how to other women for how to do like muscle building, which was really interesting. And so, close to maybe half of the women still brought some kind of like money into the family. They just weren't the primary breadwinner. It was like side gigs almost.
Right, which is how marriage has worked forever.
Right.
My grandmother stayed home, but she didn't stay home. She did odd job secretarial work. She, cleaned. She was a cleaner when she needed to be when they needed a bit of money. Like this is
Yep.
I wonder
They
how much the tradwife label is just wanting to put a label on something that is just life for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a lot of the everyday tradwives, because most of them didn't follow the aesthetic. They were like in
Mm,
yoga pants and tank tops with hair that was not brushed, like no makeup on. They were not selling an image.
mm,
They, it was their life, right? Like that they were putting, and a lot of it is cleaning videos and recipe videos and but it's often undergirded with this like gendered component that makes it different. So like the one woman, she did a great job hanging curtains. Like she got out a drill, she hung a curtain rod, hung the curtains, took us through the whole adventure of her hanging the curtains. And then like the last scene of her, minute and a half TikTok was her with her hands on her hips looking at her job going, I did a good job, but not as good as a man would have done. And you're like,
mm.
sister, you just did that. You just did that all by yourself. Like, you did great, like that there's that subtle, like gendered component that kind of permeates a lot of their thinking that I think is a little different than most even stay-at-home mothers' relationships now, but perhaps is more akin to like our mothers, our grandmothers, right? Like way of thinking about their relationship and who earns money in the home.
Um, I have another couple of questions, and we have some questions that are coming in already from our attendees. But just to remind everybody who's watching and listening, if you have questions, please just send them to me directly in the chat, and I will pose them to Becky. And thank you for the questions that have come through already. Et quand j'ai dit au début, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez les poser en français et je vais les traduire pour Becky. Mais pas la réponse, désolée. Okay, so I want to talk about radicalization and social media because, we've kind of skirted around this topic that this is a community, an online community that has far right elements, that has extremist elements. And one thing that Josephine writes about in the article is kind of like how trad lifestyle can kind of tip towards survivalism, can tip towards extremist violence, these kind of things. So, what is that pipeline? Have you looked at that at all? The pipeline between just like, oh, I want to hang curtains nicely and bake nice sourdough to very far right, xenophobic, racist, misogynist, homophobic, dangerous far right views.
Yeah. It's a tricky question, right? Because the women were so diverse, some of them absolutely came to tradwife life from this more like live off the land, be independent. A lot of time that meant independence from the government.
Mhm.
Um, and even an attempt for the husband, the breadwinner, to not be working for somebody else. So there was a couple people who were trying to like start their own ranches or their own farms, right? Like to really kind of go back to that really highly self-reliant, you know, canning, making your own food, like living off the land, living off the grid, like not paying for electricity, not paying for water. So there was definitely some of those themes in there, which then, some people have asked, like, are they a movement? Which I think is hard because, like, if you're making an individual choice to do a thing, but a lot of people make that individual choice, then there is movement. But are they like an organized movement where they're trying to accomplish particular aims or have objectives? Like I would argue, no, there doesn't seem to be a lot of them feeling part of a movement of trying to change society in some way. A few talked about that where they're like, maybe we can like lead by example and other people will follow us, right? Like, but there wasn't like a clear ideology or set of goals. Um, but some of the women, like between my colleague and I, we joked around where we're like, she's recruitable for like extremism. Like they're gonna find her and get her, right? Like that other scholars have talked about that pipeline of like some people who start viewing what on the surface seems like very mundane, again, cooking, cleaning, grocery hauls. I don't know if there's a good translation for haul videos that are in the English language TikTok accounts where you like show off everything you bought at the grocery store or at
Oh,
yeah, or everything you bought on
mhm.
Amazon. You open the boxes for your viewers. And so it seems very relatable to a lot of women and mothers and, but then they like sneak in some of that, the gendered ideologies and and that women who for whom that like resonates can find their own way into more extremist content. I didn't get a sense of any of these women being like recruiters. Again, a couple of them that I was like, oh, they are so recruitable, like into some of these movements, which is partly why we're tracking some of these women over time. Actually, we check back in on their accounts periodically just to kind of see what's going on. And some have actually left the tradwife lifestyle in the 2 years since we first started sort of watching them. And some have privated their accounts. And so those are hard to know. Like, are they going into more extremist spaces and don't want to be public anymore? Or have they left the lifestyle, right? Like we don't know when somebody just privates their account. But it's definitely not a static, like line that can be drawn around who is or who isn't, right? There's lots of people who are sort of coming in and coming out, sort of trying it on to see if it fits, right? And then maybe finding one of these other communities, like they intersected with like cottage core communities, slow living communities. Um, like here in the US, we say like, California or like granola or crunchy communities or hippie communities, if people know what hippies are,
Yep.
that are more like liberal leaning. Some of them I could see passing through tradwife lifestyles into some of those lifestyles. So rather than, like a deep recruiting tool, I think extremists would have a hard time picking from, they'd have to watch a lot of tradwife content to find the ones who are recruitable. But are they
Mhm.
there? Yes. And if somebody reached out to them, and particularly around transgender related issues, the most vitriolic things that these women said were around the inclusion of trans people in sports, the inclusion of trans women as women. Some of them bordered up against sort of turf ideologies, right? So trans radical, wait, I always forget, trans exclusionary radical feminist language, that there was some uniformity around the exclusion of trans women, and trans issues that was common across. So that, where a lot of times we think of extremism around race and ethnicity, there wasn't, there was not a lot of really visible racism or, ethnic bias, a little bit, because in the US we have a lot of migration issues right now. So some anti-immigrant sentiment. But the most vitriolic language was around um, gender diversity, basically. Because it violated their worldview, right? That men are like this and women are like this, and
And
so
that's fixed.
yeah. So I think again it bumps up against extremism, but I don't see it as like a super highway into extremism. But could people find their way from tradwives to extremists? Like absolutely. And could extremists find tradwives to recruit? Yes, but they're so diverse that I don't know that it would be really fruitful for them to watch that much tradwife content to find the ones who are recruitable.
It's only useful to you to watch all of that tradwife content, Becky, so that you can tell the rest of us all about it so that we don't have to.
But I mean, that's where that idea of like the recruitment, because like I am a single mom and I work full time. I'm an academic, right? Which is more than full time. And I have two
Mm,
young children. And when in the midst of the pandemic, right, when we started watching their videos, like what they are selling of like, what if you didn't have to go out there and be a gangbusters worker and come home and feel like you're not being a good enough parent and you're never a good enough work, like the again, that romanticization of like, oh my God, what if I only had to focus on one thing? I could be a great mom if I could just focus on being a great mom, right? Like there is something that again that they're tapping into that feminism that shares, right? With the reality that the expectations we have of women right now are unrealistic. And so what they have to sell was attractive
mm,
when you first start listening, right? But then the more you listen and the more you think about it, like then you go like, no, right? Like that's, wait a minute, no, this isn't like, that's not really what they're selling. That's not really right. But there is that sense of like, oh my God, like what if I could just focus on a thing and do it really well? That is attractive. So I
Yeah.
have to, even as being raised as feminist, watching, 60 different people's 2 years worth of content, there was a point where you were like, this actually doesn't sound as bad as I thought it might. Then you have to like back away and be like, no, wait, wait, you know? So yeah, you can get
Oh,
sucked in.
that's so interesting. Well, I recently went back on Instagram for the first time in 8 years. I regret it. But I went
Mm.
on and I've been doing some work around my home. So I was looking at renovations and that, and it was amazing how quickly the algorithm went from, what color should I paint my cupboards to satisfying cleaning video to tradwife. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, do you know who you're dealing with here? This is
Mhm.
not, the algorithm has not understand who I am as a feminist, but maybe, it just shows that there is a pipeline.
Yeah.
Um, and that's why you should never do renovations on your home.
And if you think of like Venn diagrams, right?
Mm,
Like the tradwife circle doesn't stand alone. Like it intersects with so many tradwives by the old country farmhouse. They are
hmm
renovating it. They're showing you
hmm
their renovation videos while they're trying to, fix the backyard up to raise their own food. And like it absolutely intersects with
mm,
a whole host of other communities and cultures. And again, are we going to be visitors to their ideology, like, or do we stay, right? Where I think a
mm,
lot of people, my suspicion is a lot of people pass through, they don't get on the pathway, like they don't get on the highway, but they
yeah.
pass through in some fashion or other. So we're all intersecting with them in various ways.
I also think just like consider becoming a punk if you want to drop out of society. I just want to throw it out there. They also have the answers. Maybe that's like a very 1980s
Mm,
solution that I have, but that's a nice, drop out for a bit, be a punk, get some piercings, and then you can come back.
right?
Um,
And tattoos.
so we
That
do
was
have some
interesting
questions.
too. So many of the women had tattoos.
Oh, that's very interesting. You're
Yes.
right.
Yeah, like they were, and a lot of them had different color hair. Like
Yeah.
they didn't fit the mold of like the beaver cleaver mom, you
Mhm.
know, Brady mom. Like they didn't fit the aesthetic.
Well, this is brings me to one of our questions, which is, this person is talking about the same paradox that I mentioned, whereas, they are turning their lifestyle into a source of income.
Yeah,
But is this so? How much of it is aesthetics?
I think again for the women who are like pointedly trying to make money off of it,
Mm,
they are selling the aesthetic.
right.
Um, for the everyday trad wife folks that we looked at, like the broader 60, only two out of our 60 that we looked at on TikTok had ever done like a newspaper interview. One of them was relatively famous. That she tried her best to look like Marilyn Monroe. So she was like making the leap from an everyday trad wife to the
The
more
famously traditional Marilyn Monroe.
it is weird because she totally like she would try to talk like
Oh my
Marilyn,
goodness.
and she
Yeah.
had blonde hair, and she always did like a really like I'm not a makeup person, but like a soft makeup look, not a real
Mhm.
bright like red lip and things like that.
Yeah.
And so like she obviously was tapping into that like appeal.
Mm.
Then would wear like country dresses, and her videos were always baking videos and cleaning videos, but she would always strategically put the camera like mid-torso. So you saw her from like
Yeah.
here to like here. Yes. So so again, she was kind of in the like when we're talking about pipelines or highways, she was kind of trying to make the leap into the more aesthetic version of the tradwife life. But the everyday women, again, they weren't cashing in, at least not on TikTok. They did not have the kind of engagement that you need to make money off of it.
Right.
Um, But some women who are strategic, like Nara Smith is a really good example. Like, again, she does not identify as a tradwife,
Mm.
but she absolutely is cashing in and purposefully portraying that on the internet to raise money for herself. Like that is part of her business model is to
Mm.
sell that image on TikTok. So yeah, so some women do it, yes, purposefully, and but the everyday women aren't making money in that way, or if they are, it's not a lot.
So another question we have is around, and I think I have time for two questions from the audience here, is, and I guess this is more your personal opinion, but we talk about how these are responding to some of the same issues that feminists raise. They are recruitable to feminism in as much as they may be recruitable to anything else. So what do you think would be kind of like a good feminist response to the tradwife phenomenon? To either counteract it or to
Mhm.
refute.
That's a great question. I think feminism, at least in the US, I don't know more broadly, but at least in the US, got a really bad reputation. Like we had a slang we said feminazis, where very like militant feminists who again had sometimes unrealistic demands of other women, that turned a lot of women off of feminism as a movement or as something that's, working for women. A lot of women, again, I can only speak for the US, but a lot of young US women are hesitant to label themselves as feminists. So I think, feminism has a lot of work to get women's buy-in again, just like overall, to kind of undo. And again, we can argue about where that feminazi label came from and like how it got propagated and who did the propagating. But I think some of what they were also talking about is perceiving antagonism between femininity and feminism, is also something that feminists need to pay attention to. That a lot of them perceive this demand to reject femininity, to reject, looking beautiful, to reject, the finer things in life, almost like this trying to be like a monk, right? Kind of, or, the the image of like the pantsuit, no makeup, hair, just in a ponytail, right? Like to work against that sort of narrative around that's what a feminist is, I think is important to pay attention, right, to what they're saying. If they perceive feminism as being antagonistic to femininity, right? Most feminists, I would argue, don't agree with that. But if that's their perception, right, like how do we tap back into that? I think one of the tradwives also brought up, it's easier to just sort of like go with this lifestyle than to try to like train my husband how
Ah,
to be a home help around the house, right? Like
yeah.
I think, the more that feminism can include men also, like the more we can help. How do we raise our sons? How do we, like, although it is exhausting to train our partners, like, how do we, think about the reach to men as well? Um, because if women in their own households weren't having to do the training for their partners and training somebody how to do laundry and, you know,
Hmm.
right? That if men were more equal partners, it would be easier, I think, for feminists to connect with the women who are moving towards this lifestyle. Um, because they do feel like the fight is against society in some ways, right? Um, and so if feminists can help these women who feel disenfranchised see how they can find those pieces that they can have actionable elements, right? I think that would also be really helpful. Like you're not going to change everything today, sister, but like here's the thing that you can do for today, or like here's the thing that even if you're staying at home, right? Um,
I wonder if
yeah,
there's something also in the joy of community. I mean, for me, the joy of feminism is being in community with other people who want to
yeah,
make the world better, who are, it strikes me that the trad phenomenon is like we see the same problem. The problem
mm,
is inequality. The
yeah,
problem is sexual violence.
yeah,
But so either you go, that's all too scary, and you retreat into the domestic domain,
yeah,
or you say, okay, well, let's build something better. And there's actually a lot of, even if you don't do it in your own lifetime, there's a lot of joy in that.
yeah. And also, I mean, we're seeing a lot of women choosing careers and not choosing families at all, right? So on the one hand, we're fascinated by tradwives
Mm.
and their rejection of, sort of wage labor and they want to move toward the domestic sphere. But we are also seeing women, many of whom I think would call themselves feminists, who are rejecting like because we cannot do both. Like it is so hard to do both, and so they choose career, right? And so
Yeah,
we are seeing like declining birth rates, declining marriage rates. Like, this is a phenomenon that's working in both directions, right? And so, how do we help men and women, everybody, if they want to choose both? Like, how do we facilitate that, but also validate if they want to choose one or the other, right?
Mhm.
But how does it still help us move towards a better society? Not that retreat feeling, but like how is me choosing to be a homemaker, still, how can I still help with the movement, or like how can I
Yeah,
still other women, right? Like because again, the isolation I think is going to backfire for so many of these women. And so many of them were like totally in denial that their husbands would ever leave, that their husbands would ever get injured, that like there would ever be domestic violence in their house. Like, and isolation works for a while, but it's hard to maintain for a lifetime because we need each other. Like we need
mm,
each other. So
absolutely.
yeah. So I agree. I think community offering this a different kind of community for them that's not this isolating one is another route to go.
Well, that's us at time. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Becky, for giving up your lovely Hawaiian evening to spend the morning with us here in Paris. Just if you've enjoyed this discussion, please make sure that you are subscribed to the evidence, and please tell your friends to subscribe as well. Yes, just another big thanks to Becky, and thanks for everybody for being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone. Aloha.